Thank you. Welcome everyone for joining us for our next edition of the industry chat. I am going to pause a bit as I see people coming into the webinar today. My name is Noemi Guevara. I'm the Director of Alumni Engagement here at California State University, Long Beach. Thank you again for joining us today. Before we start, just want to let you know the session is being recorded and it will live on our website at csulb.edu/alumni. And also, I want to encourage you throughout our chat today to submit any questions using our Q&A box located above or below your screen for our guest speaker. And now it's my honor to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. David Lechuga. Dr. Lechuga is in private practice. He is a neuropsychological consultant for the Los Angeles Kings, LA Football Club, and LA Galaxy. He is a past president of the California Psychological Association. Dr. Lechuga is a past president of the Hispanic Neuropsychological Society and their current administrative director. He is also chair of CPA's Division of Neuropsychology as well as clinical instructor at UCLA. Dr. Lechuga is a fellow of NHS and Sports Neuropsychological Society. He is board certified in clinical psychology and rehabilitation psychology from the American Board of Professional Psychology and board certified in neuropsychology from the American Board of Professional Neuropsychology. Dr. Lechuga earned his BA in research psychology from the beach. Hosting today's industry chat, please help me in welcoming Dr. David Lechuga. Thank you so much, Dr. Lechuga, for joining me today.
Sure.
And can I call you David?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Yes.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again for joining us in our industry chat. And I usually like to start off these chats from the beginning to get to know you a little bit better. Finding out, did you come to the beach straight from high school? Did you transfer? And if you could share with us a little bit of what your experience through Long Beach State was.
Sure. So it's kind of an unusual experience in the sense that when I finished high school, I went to Bishop Montgomery High School in Torrance. I grew up in Carson, but our mom didn't want us going to Carson High.
I live in Carson, so I know what you're talking about.
She had some strong reservations, so they kept us in Catholic school and then suggested that we continue in Catholic school. My brother decided to go to Carson High. He did just fine. And then I went to Bishop Montgomery and graduated from there. But our parents did not finish 6th grade and 8th grade. That's as far as they went. And I'm Mexican and Filipino by background, kind of a typical Carson blend. And families mainly like migrant farm workers and, first generation US immigrants. So I was really fortunate to A, finish high school, and B, to go to a high school that was pretty decent. So there was some element of privilege in that regard where the family could put their money into education. Not a lot of families had the money to put into education, as you can imagine. And so my brother and I were the first to graduate from high school and decided, hey, it might be kind of good to go to college. That seems to be what all the people from Mirror Lest and Rolling Hills do. So let me try this. So went to Long Beach State for one semester, and basically it was on my own then, because again, the family didn't have the resources to pay for tuition, let alone fund like living on campus or any of that. It was extravagant. So ended up going one semester in the fall of 1975. It's a long time ago. But because it was so difficult financially, I ended up going in the military. So I went in the United States Air Force as an enlisted person. And that was good because that got me kind of on track. It was after the Vietnam. So there wasn't an active war, but there were remnants of war. It wasn't exactly popular to be in the military then. Not like it is now. No one thanked you for your service. In fact, they gave you, quite different reactions if you were in the military. Made all kinds of assumptions. But the point was I went in for a lot of other reasons, and primarily to get the GI Bill. And I heard that Long Beach State was very good with veterans. And so having the VA next door and then having an active veterans office there. So I went in and they promptly began reducing the forces. So they let me out early with an honorable discharge, and I applied to Long Beach State and was granted readmission, as an advanced sophomore, and I came back in like 1979. So I was very grateful to be back in 79, no, 77, because they let us out so early in the military. But I came back and realized what a privilege it is to be able to go to school, because in the military, there's two levels. There's the officer and enlisted. And clearly the officers had more pay, better housing, more benefits. And, I don't begrudge them that, but it was a caste system. So if you had education, like a college degree, you were in this elevated caste. We saluted you. If you did not have education, you were in the lower class, enlisted. We still did important work, but you did not get saluted. You got promoted, but you're never going to make the money that an officer made or have the privileges of an officer. So it perpetuated a little bit of the discriminatory practices that I saw growing up, but it was just the system, and you kind of accept it or you don't. So you accept it until you're not in it anymore. But I saw that education was a path out. So that's where I came back to Long Beach State. And I guess the last little pieces before I went in the military, there was a book sale at the bookstore. It was like a nickel a pound book. And I picked up 3 books before I left. And, I was going to basic training right after I finished. One was on philosophy, Western philosophy. The other was on business practices. These are like introductory courses. And the third one was on psychology, introduction to psychology. I didn't know what psychology was. I didn't know how to spell it. Never had a course in psychology, never had a clue as to what it was as a field. But when I finished all my training in the military, I looked at all 3 books. The philosophy book was alien to me. I didn't grow up reading Immanuel Kant or Kierkegaard. I didn't know who these people were. I thought Immanuel Kant was a Latino guy I never heard about. I never, no idea, no judgment, but I had no idea. They had interesting concepts, but they used a lot of big words to describe things that were in your head a lot. And I just thought that's unusual, but interesting. The business book was difficult for me to understand because I was never exposed to business practices. It was like, if you had a business, maybe you sell food, get the money, buy other food to make more food. And if you had any left over, that's great.
Right.
But the psychology book, I read cover to cover. I read every word, no lie. I read everything in the index, everything under the captions. And so when I came back to Long Beach State, I thought this is an interesting major. So I majored in it. And I asked people, well, who's the toughest instructor here? It's kind of like in the military, you want the toughest trainer. Right. And so I thought, well, if I could get an A in this person's course, and that was Dr. Roy Hines, who had a doctorate in psychology from Princeton. And people would make fun of Dr. Hines because he was a big man. He wore the same uniform every time. He had a white shirt, black pants, and he would sweat when he lectured in that big lecture hall in the psychology building, but he was brilliant. And I thought, if I get an A in this class, I'm going to major in psychology. I got an A. I really loved learning from him. And that's kind of set me in the direction of my chosen field. In addition to working in the VA next door, I got exposed to the practice of psychology, and that kind of cemented my direction.
Wonderful. That's what I was going to ask. Like, because I have research psychology, did you do any kind of research under maybe Professor Hines or any other professor when you were here?
Yeah, I didn't have a chance to work with Dr. Hines, thank you, but I worked with John Jung. So yes. Dr. Jung was an associate professor at that time. I might have been a full professor, but he was great and really was a mentor and a guide, and started talking about graduate school for me. I had no idea about graduate school. Again, it's just another world you don't hear about.
Right. Especially for our first generation, and we don't know what college is going to be like, let alone a graduate degree.
No. And the only thing you're going to get from your family, in my household, we had Mexican and Filipino. So both felt like education was important. But on the Filipino side, all they could say was, oh, you have to go to the university.
What does that mean? Right.
The university. Well, it's not like Manila. And the Mexican side, it was, well, look, mijo,
Figure it out.
go to school and God bless you. Don't be late for dinner, huh? And that was it,
Yeah. Or mass on Sunday.
Yeah, you better go to church.
Yes.
God's watching all the time, mijo. Be careful. All those warnings, And
Yes,
so, but they were cool with school. They didn't know what I was doing. So it was a little alien, but you learn how to live within that system because you're not in the system. And then all of a sudden you're evolving out of the system.
Right.
And I didn't want to stay in the kind of circle that was happening where I grew up because at that time, there were a fair amount of gangs and there were people getting shot and going to prison. And you could see the ones that survived were the ones who went to the military. They're older than me, they went to Vietnam, and many were killed, many were shot, many came home because you saw it was pretty much a brown and black war. And that's what you learn is that the poor people are the ones that suffer, and those with money don't suffer as much, at least overtly. That's the initial perception of a young person. So I was glad to be able to have some opportunities.
Wonderful. So I have quite a few questions here in the queue. As a first generation student, what was your journey like on your way to graduate school and then later on to a PhD?
So it was hard because being a first generation student and being a person of color, there weren't many peers. And, not to denigrate or put down, but all my professors were white. All of them were from wealthier areas, but they all were loving and supportive. So yeah, I could cop an attitude and say, hey, it's not my world and I don't want to be part of that world. But I thought also, I looked around and I saw the people who lived in Rancho Palos Verdes were usually the third generation out. The first generation was the immigrant. Second was kind of where I was at. And third generation was their kids who, if they benefited from the parents, they did well. If they were spoiled by the parents, they didn't do well. So I kind of watched this as a kid. I thought, yeah, okay, that person's on drugs. They have too much money. And, these people appreciate it. So I realized it took some time. So I felt really insecure because at UCLA, then it was the top program in psychology in the nation, doctorate program. And all my peers were, with the exception of one, pretty much folks from families that had education in their background. So I always felt like I'm from Long Beach State, but they were from Yale, Harvard, Oberlin. I thought Oberlin was a musical instrument. And, Northeastern, I guess there's a Northwestern too, right? Northeastern and Boston, BU. And I'm from Long Beach State, but I didn't feel embarrassed by that. I just felt like, wow, I got in. And
I could compete with them,
Yeah, no, I did. I mean, it was hard because you have to struggle with your own imposter syndrome stuff.
Right.
And have a panic attack when you go to Westwood and you see, that's very different than Compton or Carson. But it also, I felt like, all right, I'm gonna give it a shot. Anything the military taught me is, well, look, if you can compete, if you put your energy out there, you're going to meet prejudice, but you got to compete. And at some point in time, you're going to get your shot if you demonstrate you have the drive and the expertise and you're willing to learn.
Wonderful. So how did your passion for neuropsychology begin and how were you introduced to it?
Well, it started at Long Beach State. It actually started when I was reading these books on my own while I was still on active duty. And I was always fascinated by kind of things like sensation and perception and neuroanatomy and physiology. And at Long Beach State, I took all the classes. When I asked around about graduate school, I asked, how do you get into graduate school? And someone told me there, who was a graduate student at Long Beach State at the time, a master's program in psychology. And he was a TA in many of my classes. And he said, well, take all the hardest classes and get A's in them. So I thought, okay. So I took all the supposedly hardest classes. And I guess those were all the statistics classes and all the physiological psychology and psychopharmacology classes. And I loved them. I got A's in them. I used to go inside the classroom when no one else was around. And I'd use the big blackboards to draw out everything and kind of teach myself and fill up the blackboard. I would be embarrassed if anyone saw me, but I'd fill up the blackboard with concepts, with mathematical equations, with everything. Even the janitors would come in every once in a while. I go, gee, what are you doing? I don't know. I'm not defacing anything, man.
I'm not tagging.
I'm not tagging. And if I did, it'd be a lot cleaner than this, man. So I kind of got hooked on that. And then, I got into UCLA, which is really rare, but I had great instructors there as well.
Wonderful. So can we talk a little bit about what was your first job, out of college, or did you just go straight into your continued education?
Well, my first job was, right in education, because, first job was actually the military, was McDonald's, but then in the military. And then, at UCLA, you start getting research assistantships.
Mm-hmm.
So you start kind of cutting your teeth as someone who gathers data, who thinks about questions. You're trained how to answer your questions. I mean, the one thing they told us the first day at UCLA, this professor named Elliot Rodnick, he's a professor emeritus. Again, I didn't know what emeritus was, but right. I looked it up and said, okay, this dude's retired. God, why is he still working? I always wondered. I thought you retired and you went to, Arizona.
Hawaii.
Yeah. If you had the money, you'd go. But he was sharing his wisdom and he said, look, if you take anything from our, doctorate program at UCLA, make sure it's your curiosity. And he went on to explain how we're going to teach you how to answer questions. If you have a question, how to formulate it, how to think it through. And as a, junior professor, how to begin to answer those questions in a sophisticated way. That's what I took from what he said. I mean, he said it more succinctly, but I thought, okay, I can dig that. I'd like to learn how to do that. So my first job was really within the field. And then, of course after you finish your training, there are other jobs that you pick up.
Wonderful. You carry so many certifications and are part of so many associations. How have you found balance between your private practice and your additional commitments in the field? What guides you in terms of how you allocate your time and expertise?
Okay, well, there's one other thing at Long Beach State that I didn't mention that was as important as anything that I did in psychology. And this is why I came back to Long Beach State. No disrespect to the academics, but when I first started in 1975, there was a karate instructor there named Don Dupree. And he's probably the most dangerous man I've ever met and the most gentle man I've ever met. That paradox of a top martial artist. His instructor was Tsutsuma Oshima, who brought to the United States karate from Japan in the mid-50s. And Don was his direct student who happened to be teaching physical education karate classes at Long Beach State. So I took his class before I went in the military. And I realized when I was going through basic training, I thought, Don Dupree would take out all these drill instructors very easily. I thought that inspired me. And he was a good person. And he very modest, but embodied what I thought a martial artist should be. So I came back and I started training with him in karate. And that taught me how to balance things in a sense, where I always maintained, I've continued to train in the martial arts from that date forward. Same organization with the same top instructor. And Don unfortunately passed away about 10 years ago. But that really helped me understand the importance of health, physical health, and the importance of balance. And it's not easy, but it also taught me not to pursue something unless I was interested in it. I felt like I had an ability to grow in it. I guess the last thing it taught me is that you don't know everything. And so what if you have all these degrees, all these certifications? They mean nothing if you're a horrible person. And Mr. Oshima, who's what top, gave me all my rank in the martial art, would always put that on us. Like, it's about you. You sacrifice before somebody else. You stand while someone sits. You let them eat first. You sacrifice. You always take care of the person that can't take care of themselves. And don't be loud about it. So that helped me a lot, because that humility is built in a martial art, because there's always somebody bigger, meaner, stronger, if you want to talk about the physical element, but there's also someone who's better than you as a human being, who's more developed, who's more humble, who's quiet. They're not the loudmouths, they're the quiet ones, the humble ones. Those are the people you want to emulate. And so I really took that to heart, and that helped.
Wonderful. Yeah, usually I work with the Career Development Center, and their recruiters often share that one of the reasons why they go with Long Beach State students over any other school is of how humble our students are and how talented they are.
Right,
So that's
right.
a very trait that we have here.
Yeah, there's a misperception that if you go to Long Beach State, somehow you're not as smart. And, you know, that was a misperception in my time. And I found that to be horribly wrong, because my undergraduate degree at Long Beach State prepared me to do graduate work at UCLA. The only weakness was my own weakness, and that was in my writing skills. And so after my first year at UCLA, we wrote for all of our classes. There's no exam. There were exams, but the final was always a written paper. So, you know, because I was relatively weak in that area, and I date that back to elementary school, then so I took some advanced composition classes at UCLA, which is great. It was hard and kind of humiliating, but humbly, it made me humble in my writing skills, and I continue to use those skills today. So that was a skill that I would have honed a little bit better had I known I needed to hone it before I went to UCLA, but it became painfully obvious, and I just did what I did to remediate that.
Right. That was going to be one of my next questions. You know, what skills do you think someone should be working on right now if they want to pursue a career in neuropsychology in the future?
Well, I really love that you can do degrees. Like my degree was in psychology research, but it was really probably the equivalent of a biopsychological degree or psychobiology degree that I see now, or perhaps a cognitive neuroscience degree. But I think it's important to have the breadth of studies as an undergraduate in psychology, your abnormal psychology, your developmental psychology, you know, your social and personality psychology, and have your statistical classes, your physio classes, and psychopharmacology if you can. So that's probably more like a psychobiology major now. So there's that. And then it's also important to get around professors that are doing research if you want to go into a PhD. You don't have to be hardcore about it, but it's important to learn how to study a phenomenon and to begin to evolve the chops, if you will, of doing that. And you do that as an undergraduate by collecting data, by participating in programs, and by learning, just like anything, you know, side by side mentoring, and then start to hone your ability to think that through. And I guess the last thing is do experiences that expose you to being around your field of interest. If it's clinical work, then you can volunteer, you can participate in different programs. Student Counseling Center, I was at the VA, so I worked in a pain program there. And just get a feel for the field. And then that combination of academic expertise, exposure to research, ideally participating in some research, and then also some clinical involvement really prepares you well for entering into a competitive graduate program.
Right. Great. Thank you. So I'm reading some of my questions here. What do your roles look like as a neuropsychological consultant for the various professional sports teams? How have you been able to apply your skills and marry it with sports?
Right. So I think this is where the martial arts background has always helped me, because I feel very comfortable, not that I'm comfortable around violence or being violent, but I feel comfortable around violence in a weird, sick way. So hockey's pretty violent at times, but it's all controlled. And you kind of have to appreciate the physicality of some of these sports. Soccer is very physical, as you know.
Right.
I also take care of the new rugby team, and back up with the Rams as well. So, and then a lot of female athletes, both at the amateur and now professional level. But I think you just get an interest in this area. And I'm going to a conference, my first in-person conference in 2 years next week. It's the Sports Neuropsychological Society. So I became interested in sports-related concussions years ago, 20 years ago. And then in that process, you get connected up with people nationally and internationally when you go to conferences. And you do, like if you're a graduate student, you do your clinical work and research in areas germane to that area of sports-related concussion, for example, or performance. And by that connection, then people get to know you, you get to know them. And my good friend, Ruben Echemadilla, another Latino guy who's the head of neuropsychological programs over the Major League Soccer And over the NHL, he asked me, he said, hey, somebody's moving to take care of their mom back east, and there's an opening for the LA Kings. Or would you be interested? I said, hey, sure.
Why not?
Hey, why not? Just give me the, what do I need to do, and give me a little mentoring, and I'll do the best that I can. And before you know it, 2007, I became the sports neuropsychologist for the Kings, 2010 for the Galaxy. And then when the LAFC came online for LAFC, and it's been great. I mean, I went through 2 Stanley Cups with the Kings, which is amazing.
So do you have to go to all the games?
No, I could, but it's so far. I'm down in Orange County. If I was back in
Right.
Carson, I'd be there all the time.
Right.
Sometimes I bemoan the fact that I moved from Carson, but jobs took me elsewhere. But I could, and I love going to the games. But also, it's kind of a balance, right? I'm not employed by them. I do cases when they get injured. So you bill workers' compensation, and it's really important to have that boundary. You can be a fan, but you don't want to be so much of a fan that you lack objectivity when you do what's right for the athlete. Because my job is to take care of the athlete. And if he or she is not ready to go from a neuropsychological perspective, then they don't play. And I don't care if it's playoff, World Series, World Cup, because if they get hurt when they're still symptomatic, it could change their life and their family's lives. And I have to have that on my shoulders when I evaluate them, like any healthcare professional who's doing this work with professional athletes or amateur athletes. So I really enjoyed that. And I like the ability that they have to respect that decision. They may not like it, but they respect it. And the players, I think, begin to respect you over time because they realize you're about taking care of them and their families, not about taking care of an organization above and beyond them and viewing them as just a,
Commodity.
some kind of inanimate object.
Yeah, definitely. Great. What types of clients do you focus on in your private practice?
Yes, so I'm fading my practice because I'm looking to prepare for retirement, if you will. But I've only worked with people who have sustained some sort of traumatic injury, and because I've always been moved when I've worked in inpatient medical settings and outpatient treatment settings. I've always been moved by how someone's life could be going in one direction, and they have an event that forces them to make a change, left or right. There's no decision. They cannot go back. Someone has a stroke. There's no way they're going to unstroke unless you catch them earlier on and you do some procedures to relieve that clot or thrombus, perhaps, to break it up, if it is that type of stroke. But for the most part, that single person has to live with whatever happened. There's no choice. And I really found it to be a privilege to be with them, to help them begin to process that. Like, my life is now changed, and depending on their cognitive wherewithal, if the injury damaged more critical structures in the brain, they may not even be able to process that they're changed. But if they can, it's painful, and it's an adjustment, but it's a place of truth. It's one of the few places in life where you can speak very frankly, very truthfully with anybody about, regardless of their background, their ethnicity, their culture, their linguistic status, or their political affiliation. You can talk with them about the reality of their life is now different, and how do you want to live henceforth, and what can we do to make life meaningful again for you? And I love that. I mean, that's a really privileged role. So that's the kind of patient I work with.
Wonderful, amazing, congratulations. Another question from our audience that says, greetings, Dr. Lechuga. This is a bit off the cuff. I am a massage therapist whose clientele is mostly dancers and intercollegiate athletes. There is a rise of depression amongst dancers. How should one approach this issue of depression? Thank you.
Right. Well, first you call it for what it is. It's sadness. It's a sense of loneliness, sense of powerlessness and helplessness. And you have to be respectful and validate that. And then slowly try to appreciate what is it about what they're feeling that is so painful for them, and what's missing for them. What's that sense of loss? And, you can go, depending on the contract, if you will. In psychotherapy, we can go in the direction of let's understand that a bit more. Let's understand your perceptions, how it's affecting you, and you get to where would you rather be? That's a big step to go to where would you rather be, because it may or may not be realistic, and it may not happen quickly, but it's not going to happen at all unless you start to look past the doom and gloom and do it carefully and respectfully, but patiently. So I think you validate, you support, and you ask them, to get some assistance with this place that they're at right now.
Well, thank you so much for answering that. How has research on brain injuries advanced throughout your time in the field? How has technology advancements played a role?
Right. So it's interesting. When I was training, neuropsychology was relatively new. It's only been around about 60 years or so, but it's relatively new, and it's more structural. So the frontal lobes do this, the temporal and parietal lobes and occipital lobes do this. And wow, there's a limbic system, which could also be considered to be a lobe, but it was a very dry brain understanding of things. And over time, this has become more of a functional understanding of neuronal networks and systems and the interconnectedness of various areas of the brain or cortex. And so that kind of dry brain versus wet brain understanding has improved over time. And some of this has been propelled by things like more advanced imaging studies of the brain. So if you get like a CT scan of the brain, it looks at tissue density. So it's very important to give when you suspect a fracture or a bleed in the brain. Like if you suspect a stroke, a CT scan can be quite definitive. There's a lot of radiation though, so you have to be careful about just giving it willy-nilly. In fact, ER protocols these days do not have you give a CT scan routinely for a suspected concussion. You do more of a clinical exam without the radiation from a CT. But MRI data, which is more sensitive to bleeding and more sensitive and sometimes more specific, can be helpful. It depends on the imaging. But the point is, imaging studies have gone from being more structural to looking at things metabolically, like their perfusion of glucose within certain areas of the brain. That tells you about the activity in the brain, and that may or may not be helpful diagnostically. So that's really been helpful. And I guess the third wave has been psychotherapy. This whole area of understanding brain behavior relationships has evolved to the point of certain structures in the brain mediate certain behaviors. And like someone could be very disinhibited. They could say what they normally might think, but censure. And certain structures in the brain, when you damage them, cause a person to be more disinhibited, as if they have no filter. And then other areas shut them down, make them less dynamic. And then still other areas can make a person feel like they have no insight. Someone who has a significant injury, particularly to the rear of their brain, sometimes will say, I'm good. I have nothing wrong with me. I can talk. Look at that. I can't move my arm, but that's not my arm. That's somebody else's arm. So they have these real interesting kind of behavioral neurological manifestations. So that understanding has really improved over time. But I think the psychotherapy, the kind of behavioral neurology, the imaging studies, and then just in my field, we do a lot of testing and assessment. Just the data that you gather about various individuals by assessing their cognition, their attention, their language, their memory, spatial, executive functions is all very helpful. And you have to put that in the context of someone's ethnicity, but really their culture and their linguistic status. And where you're hearing a lot of things about race-based norms these days, well, it's because the demographics of the United States are such that they're changing so that the norms we have are not keeping up with that. And you have to factor that in when you're trying to understand strengths and weaknesses cognitively with an individual.
Wonderful. Thank you. And this is another question from our audience. Who would you consider your mentor during your time at CSULB, and how well did you know Professor John Jung?
Well, I would consider John Jung my mentor, and I knew him, I think, reasonably well. I was always shy around him because he seemed so smart, but he was always opening doors for me, like talking about things, studying this. criticizing my papers, introduced me to Go. I wish I had continued to play Go because it was such a, tactically very, very lined up with certain martial arts and how you approach things. I don't know if you ever played Go, but it's about capturing territory. Chinese game, and they gamble with that. I've seen them in Little Saigon gambling, man, playing Go with the little white, stones. But he introduced me to that, and I wish I had spent more time with it. But I would say he was my primary mentor. The other person there was a woman named Betty Deckert. She taught the physiological psychology, the neuropsychology classes, the psychopharmacology classes. I guess the third person was a professor by the name of Ken Green. He did the physio psychology classes. I was influenced heavily by a gentleman who passed away. His name was Padilla. I think it was Gilbert Padilla, because he taught me a lot of statistics classes. But I wasn't as tight with him as I was with Dr. Jung. And then obviously in the flip side, from a martial arts perspective, was Don Dupree all the way. Don Dupree really taught me how to be a man.
Thank you. What is the most rewarding about your work and the field that you're in?
Well, the most rewarding thing is realizing that we don't understand human beings completely. And so you have to start with that because we don't understand somebody completely, we're largely ignorant until they begin to teach us about themselves. And I think being in a position of learning from another person is really powerful, regardless of their background. And then what I really like is when my presumptions are so wrong. I mean, I like it and I don't like it, because I'd like to believe I can just, I understand this person. But no, you really don't understand a human being unless they allow you to understand them, and unless they allow themselves to understand themselves. So I really like the fact that what Dr. Rudnick told us the first day of class at UCLA about being curious has held as a primary skill that's necessary from the point of professional training forward. And I think that curiosity is really important.
Wonderful. For a student and young professional, how can they get more hands-on experience and build contacts in the field? Do you recommend joining an association or finding someone to shadow? And I think you mentioned that before.
Yeah, so let's start with the organizations. In the state of California, there's a California Psychological Association. I was past president of CPA. I didn't list all my credentials because it's just ridiculous. There's too many things, and I've lived long enough, so they kind of stick on you after a while. But join California Psychological Association as a student. There are different divisions. There's a neuropsychology division. Join it. It's very, very inexpensive. And then start to affiliate. Go to conferences. See who's in your area that's a member. Meet them. Talk with them. Hear what they have to say. But be selective. Don't put people on pedestals just because they have a degree. Because they could have a degree, from advanced, high-level institution, but they could be a terrible human being. But you'll get a feel for that right away. It's just kind of get your vibe from a person. Is this a good person? Is this someone that can guide or mentor me? There aren't many good mentors out there, just because it's a skill set that's rare. But there are a lot of mediocre mentors, and I'm sure I'm one of them at times, but you get somebody that can think of your interest first, not you serving their interest. That's always a red flag. Like, I need somebody to work for me to do these things that I can't do. That's all right. That's a little bit of indentured servitude. A lot of the people that are higher level will say, be great to have you. And they'll want to teach you. They want to share. They're giving their knowledge. And this is more from the martial arts for me, but a martial arts instructor is a failure if they don't produce students that are better than them. I would say the same with a professor. I'm a failure, or we're failures, unless we have students that are better than us, smarter than us, can advance the field. So that's the kind of mentality you want to seek. And then to go in the community, work, participate, see human beings. Like Carl Jung used to talk about, the best clinicians have experienced things from different areas of the world, different people, in a humble way.
Wonderful. And yes, about talking about being out in the community. I mean, you're part of the Hispanic Neuropsychological Society. How has that experience been for you?
It's been good. It's kind of it's gotten hot the last couple of years with the whole social justice issues that have come out.
Right.
And we had a board meeting today, that one of the issues that came up was that now we're being viewed as a clique. Like, because we have a Hispanic Neuropsych Society, anybody who's white, whatever that is, Caucasian, whatever that is, feels excluded. And part of me wants to say, hey, well, now you know what it feels like, huh? Now you know what it feels like to be brown in a field of white and then not be welcomed. That's what I want to say, but I don't.
Right.
because I can appreciate where they're coming from.
Right.
And really, it's about, are we all about the same thing?
Right.
But you have to appreciate injustices that have occurred, but we have to be about how do we make this a more just society, not to be naive. So I just think it's important to have that world view as you go forward.
Yeah, definitely. Brain damage can potentially influence behavior and impair judgment. Have you seen clients and case studies that show increased likelihood in criminal behavior?
It really depends, so depending on the damage of the brain, let's say someone has more damage in the frontal systems or frontal areas of the brain, which typically give us our judgment. Do this, don't do that. In this situation, make sure you do these two things, not those two things, So you can see some impulse control problems with damage in those areas. That's possible because of a diminished capacity. And it may not be criminal behavior. Typically, it's behavior that is a mismatch with the current situation. Like you go in the store and you see these things you would like and you don't inhibit. You just kind of take them and you walk out. Someone with profound brain damage doesn't know that they have brain damage. So it's not an excuse to steal or break the law, but sometimes you see that defense in criminal issues. Oh, I had a concussion, that way that I am not responsible. And you have to have a pretty severe traumatic brain injury to the brain to lack the capacity when it comes to making a bad choice versus a good choice.
Wonderful. So now you're teaching at UCLA. How do you balance teaching and your practice, and which one do you prefer if you had to choose?
Well, my role is I'm a clinical instructor, which is the lowest rung in the academic ladder. The ego in me would like to be a professor, but to do that, you have to do certain steps.
Right.
And although I think I could qualify, you have to ask yourself, does that make me any better or less? And because what am I really about? I'm about sharing some information with the students so they can be better than me. Right. So my role is very limited. I teach maybe 2 lectures a year on certain topics, and I fall in line with other instructors who are teaching people who are interning in psychology or with a subspecialty in neuropsychology or not, because they're kind of generic clinical psychology interns. And then once you get your doctorate, you go into a fellowship program, 2 years, usually 1 to 2 years. And those that specialize in neuropsychology, I'll also supervise on cases. So I teach them more on a case-by-case basis. And those are cases that come to UCLA for an evaluation if they have a particular type of concern, whether it be a learning problem, an injury to the brain, cancer, epilepsy, whatever it may be. And the balance is really, it's not that often. So I couldn't do it. And I like it. I like teaching. The pay is terrible, but you don't do it for the pay unless you're a full-time faculty. But I really still think this society just doesn't prioritize professors or educators. And that's a fact. It just doesn't pay enough for people who are doing that kind of work.
But you're training our future leaders, and that is rewarding at the end of the day.
Yeah. You need to create space for them. And I think at my developmental stage, I need to step back so they can lead. And it's important to do that.
Wonderful. So I know I'm against time now, but before we go, any last words of wisdom you'd like to instill for our students and our alumni that are watching and will be watching the recording later?
Yeah, I guess first I want to say thank you to Long Beach State, really giving me a shot and teaching me. I really appreciate that. And I'm glad to represent California State University, Long Beach, anywhere in the world, anywhere. Never feel a lack of pride about that. But I appreciate that you need to do what good students do. You study, you sacrifice, you learn, and you park your arrogance somewhere different, because you need to have a beginner's mind in most things. I guess the last thing I would say is this is about balance. Many of us are concerned about that. Health has to be a priority. You have a long life if you take care of your health, and you can accrue, academic achievements and professional achievements over time. But to me, the priority has to be your health, your family, your profession. And if you put profession in front of your health and family, that doesn't end up well. So I think you can do both. You can do all, but it has to be patient, sequential, and keeping in mind that you're in a privileged position to go to school, to have food, to have clean drinking water, and to be able to learn and to be criticized. You don't know how much of a privilege it is to have somebody edit your papers or correct your martial art form. That's a privilege to have a teacher. So I would always respect a teacher and respect the instruction.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that reminder. You're right. We sometimes, get in the mix of things and forget about your health and all that stuff. But thank you for reminding us about that.
Yeah.
If any of our alums or students want to get in contact with you, are you on LinkedIn, or maybe if they're interested, email us and we'll put them in contact with you.
Yeah. Just do that. Just email, you can contact with me. Listen, I'm always going to answer my phone. I'm always going to answer an email, not because I have all this free time in the world. It's because you're a priority to me, because somebody did that for me.
Right.
So the least I can do is do it for you. How much time will it take? Like today, I talked with somebody for 2 minutes.
Right.
She was so impressed. I said, you don't have to be impressed here. Listen, it's a very small world if you make it a small world.
Yeah. And reach out, you never know. You need to ask those questions. Thank you so much, David. We had a great time meeting you. Thank you so much for everything you're doing out in the world, educating. We are very proud to have you as one of our alums. So thank you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Believe me, it's always my pleasure. Thank you for allowing me to get an educational start at Long Beach State.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We encourage you to visit our website and follow us on social media. Until next time.
All right. Take care.
Dave, if you could